Meanwhile, the Russian president and his security chiefs have discussed the deterioration of the situation in eastern Ukraine. The Kremlin did not say whether the meeting reached any decision over the conflict between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russia militias. While the Kremlin spokesman said ahead of the meeting that Ukraine's armed forces have repeatedly violated a ceasefire with the pro-Russians. Ukraine and Russia are locked in a bitter dispute over the issue, with Kiev accusing Moscow of deploying more forces near the border. The tensions are rising in the wake of pro-Russia elections in the two self-proclaimed republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. Meanwhile, intense shelling in Donetsk has raised fears of another full-scale war. Crossing over to Belgrade, joined by from the Center of Syncretic Studies, Mr. Joaquin Flores. Thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Flores. Tell me about the situation that is taking place between Washington, basically more Washington and Moscow. Are we headed towards a war?
You know, we have been in a civil war in Ukraine, and I think the most difficult thing to understand here is that if we had simply the Ukrainian government and the Russian government to sort this mess out, this would have been resolved a long time ago. The problem, of course, is that the U.S. backed a coup in Ukraine and spent over $5 billion to do so on the outset. And now we are living with the consequences. So I'm not surprised that the U.S. and Russia can't make anything happen, because it would seem now that the goal of the U.S. in Ukraine is not to gain even an ally in the Kiev government of Poroshenko, but rather to create an ongoing situation of perpetual chaos. And I think this is the most concerning thing.
So where do you see this going? Is it, as you're saying, perpetual chaos? Will it be just to make sure that the civil war continues as it is, or do you see an expansion of tensions?
I see an expansion of tensions, particularly including some of NATO's more recent allies, the Latvians and Poles and Lithuanians. But I think that in the particular case of Ukraine, what we will see moving forward is that the U.S. will continue to distort the facts and project its own foreign policy onto the intentions of the Russians. So while the U.S., with its over 800 bases around the world, clearly is an empire, will say instead that the Russians are building an empire by deploying soldiers within their own borders. I find it very strange and highly questionable that the U.S. would raise as a concern that the Russians have an army, that they are a state, they have a government, and that they would have their soldiers deployed within their own borders and on the borders of their own country, as opposed to, I don't know, perhaps in cities, as they happen to be in the U.S. And I think that the most troubling thing moving forward is that with the U.S. interfering in Ukraine-Russia bilateral relations, that we may even see the U.S. continue to destabilize Ukraine further, causing further damage to property. I think that the general underlying rule here is that a normal Ukraine, regardless of whatever government, center, left, right, pro-EU or pro-Russia, it doesn't really matter. So long as that government is stable, just through the normal course of trade and normal relations, diplomacy and so forth, we'll end up having a basically sound relationship with Russia. And so what happens is that the U.S. is ultimately attempting to create an unsolvable situation. So they are not negotiating in good faith. They are probably the main reason that this conflict has happened and has carried on for so long.
All right, thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Joaquin Flores from the Center for Syncretic Studies out of Belgrade.